Hey Comp 2! Chewy and I are here to tell you about your reading assignments and talk a little bit about Quiz 8 and some of the Blackboard content that we have for you. Actually, I'm here to talk to you about that. Chewy's gonna go eat dinner. Bye, Bubba. There you go. Okay, so you guys are reading David Sedaris and Sherman Alexie, and those journal questions that you use to kind of spark your thinking sometimes can always be found on Blackboard or under journal questions and supplemental materials. I wanted to talk to you before we get into the Blackboard content too much, just a little bit about some of the information that you have in your book. I promised I wouldn't read large swaths of text to you, and I'm going to still try to keep it pretty short. But the way that the Norton Introduction to Literature describes cross-cultural encounters, which is the subunit of fiction that David Sedaris and Sherman Alexie's stories fall into, the section that they have on these cross-cultural encounters is just really kind of inspiring. And even though you could read it for yourselves, I'd like to point out just a few integral sections to you. So it begins by saying, few of us in today's increasingly wired world either inhabit or trace our roots to a single culture. Rather, most of us live across cultures and identify with multiple tribes, habitually performing rituals both ancient and modern, whether we recognize them as such or not. When Native American author Sherman Alexie, who you'll be reading, describes himself as just as influenced by sitcoms as powwows, he might as well be speaking for most of us. Whether or not we choose to watch television, see Hollywood movies, eat at McDonald's, or post to Facebook, few, if any of us, can avoid being heavily influenced by these phenomena or participating in the shared culture they help constitute. Yet, like Alexie and Sedaris, each of us has a slightly different relationship to that common culture, depending in part upon where we, our parents, and even our grandparents grew up, what language we speak or read, what faiths we practice. But one of the most exciting literary developments of the past half century has been the emergence of so-called post-colonial literature. That is, works written either by those raised in former colonies or by their children and grandchildren who may never have even visited their cultural homelands. Not surprisingly, that literature often investigates the varied ways in which cultures intersect and clash today, as well as the ways in which today's world has been shaped by the cultural confrontations of yesterday. By exploring such issues, post-colonial literature, and indeed, even more recent literature, to step outside the Norton for a second, even more recent literature that deals with immigration and second-generation Americans, it may help us to navigate our own distinctly modern world, but it also builds on a tradition stretching from literature's very beginnings to today's popular culture. What else, after all, are Homer's Odyssey, Shakespeare's The Tempest, and even perhaps the Christian Bible about, if not cross-cultural encounters? Just what do each of these characters learn, and what might their stories reveal about the way culture and environment shape us, both linking us to and dividing us from others? What might the stories suggest about when and why cross-cultural communication or translation fails? How do the stories define the costs and benefits of literally and figuratively learning a new language, journeying outside our familiar world, even seeing ourselves and our own culture as others do? So that's kind of the goal behind reading Alexie and Sedaris. And you'll find Sedaris in the Norton Introduction to Literature. You have those page numbers on your syllabus. The Alexie story, Flight Patterns, is no longer in our most recent edition, but I have been able to acquire a copy that you're allowed to look at and read through on Blackboard. Underneath Journal Questions and Supplemental Materials, if you'll click the Fiction folder and scroll down to Cross-Cultural Analysis, Alexie and Sedaris, you'll have access to that story there. So you can read Alexie on Blackboard and you can read Sedaris in your book. If you have any questions about that, feel free to email me. Also, under Journal Questions and Supplemental Materials on Blackboard is a cross-cultural exercise. And if you open that exercise, what it is it's called the Herman Grid. And the instructions are down below on the second page. And it says to ask everyone who's looking at the grid to share their impressions. And if they see gray dots at the white intersections, are the gray spots really there? This is kind of a visual example of how we sometimes see things that are not really there. And then there are a couple of discussion questions there. And I had been mulling over what we should do for quiz 8. We kind of just, gave the color of our eyes and then went on past quiz 7 because we were trying to work on so much reading at one time. But for quiz 8, I didn't want you guys to just have to do another discussion board the way you have been. Discussion boards are great. They're a wonderful tool, but they can get a little labor heavy, frankly. So one of your classmates, unprompted, actually emailed me their answers to these 2 questions on the Hermann Grid handout. And the first one is, have you ever had a wrong first impression of someone who had a different background or came from another culture? And has someone from a different background or another culture ever had the wrong first impression of you? And sometimes this is even subcultural within the United States. It doesn't have to be international cultures to consider cross-cultural analysis. Sometimes it's simply being from New York and visiting Texas for the first time, or vice versa. So think about those questions and send your answers to me for quiz 8.